Excuse me, can you take a photo of me?
Sure, but if you had the new Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 6, you could snap your own hands-free selfies.
Really?
Watch! I just flex it to the perfect angle, set it down, and FlexCam with Galaxy AI automatically zooms for the perfect shot.
Whoa.
Post-worthy.
New profile pic-worthy.
Flex the newest Galaxy AI foldable Z Flip 6. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Samsung account login required. FlexCam length varies and is shorter than standard zoom length. Galaxy AI provided free until end of 2025 on supported devices.
The Starbucks cold brew you love is now available in a can. It's so good you'll believe that too good to be true can be true. Like finding out that you and your crush have been listening to the same playlist on repeat. With the smooth taste of Starbucks cold brew in a can, sipping is believing. Available in 3 delicious flavors. Shop now wherever you buy groceries. Click or tap the banner to learn more.
When it comes to fitness, what's real? How about when it really truly fits your life? That's how Anytime Fitness sees it. Because our coaches see you. It's how they build personal plans that work wherever you are and focus on everything that matters, from fitness to nutrition to recovery, all so you can push yourself further than ever, or just through the next rep. It's total 360 support for a real difference. That's Anytime Fitness. That's real AF. Visit AnytimeFitness.com.
Well, hello there, mega orderers. This is Alex Hall, and today you are getting something really special, a celebration of our first year anniversary of the Disorder Show. Here's a clip of some of our best moments.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is
Disorder.
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 Disorder. Disorder.
The surprisingly good podcast, as my husband describes it, where we try to make sense and order out of our mad world.
Well, here we are, Alex. It's the first episode of Disorder.
Hi, Jason.
Shall the podcast long endure and the global mess we find ourselves in quickly dissipate?
Halfway through this 12 hours of negotiations, Adams leaned over the table and said to me, "The thing I like about you, Jonathan, is you blush when you lie," which is indeed true. And Bill Jeffrey, who was sitting next to me, the Northern Ireland office official, leaned back across the table and said, "Unlike you, Jerry." And actually, that summed the thing up.
Now what's coming to my mind is rejoice, rejoice, rejoice greatly.
Going and speaking out against Trump cost me my home. It cost me my job. It cost me the relationship that I was in at the time. It cost me my personal security and my life savings.
He always assured everyone everything's going to be okay. You know, he was telling the Russian people and everybody else that, no matter how bad it is, it's all going to be okay. And then he's dead.
Well, if I'm queen for a day of the entire world, I would gather all the rest of the world leaders, take them to a retreat, and get them to calm down.
People do trust a centrist dad saying, we're going to listen to people. This is not rocket science.
I'm going to end this episode by returning back to my boy's teenage bedroom.
Love it.
Because I think I have to work a little bit in partnership with them.
It is, as always, Alex, a pleasure to disagree agreeably with you and to allow the listeners to come up with their own opinions. It's exactly 1 year to the day since Disorder launched. Firstly, I believe that thank you to our various teams are in order. The first thank yous go to Jack Davenport, Gary Lineker, and Neil Fearn, and the whole Goalhanger team for, having faith in us and making this happen. And then to those close to me who gave the idea, sculpted the concept. Big thank you to Zena Starbuck, Brian Klaas, and Verity Hubbard. And thanks to you, our mega orderers. We're a top 20 UK podcast and a top 5 politics podcast that achieved over 1 million listens in less than a year. As we hope to go from strength to strength, we are looking at some new and exciting partnerships on the horizon that can bring different types of guests and formats of the show. We hope to be unveiling these new partnerships and formats in the next few months.
Yeah, so Jason, I have to add a few thanks of my own. First of all, to you, because you made this show happen. It was based on your idea, your concept, your drive, your imagination, and your determination to make it happen. So hats off to you, Jason. I was just toddling along in my own little world, and a mutual friend of ours, somebody else who deserves thanks, Arthur Snell, was the one who connected us. And then I cannot end without, of course, saying thank you to the hidden partner in this show, which is George McDonagh, who then spent months coaching me to sound less uppity, less formal, less straitjacketed, more human, more natural. Take 2, take 3, take 4, Alex. And that is, of course, George, who embellishes, polishes, hones, and deletes to make what finally comes out actually sound good. So thank you, George. None of this would be possible without you as well.
He is the one, the only, the George McDonagh.
But we're not going to sit here boasting and back scratching and being too flattering. We want to talk about some of the most wonderful guests we've had on this show. And we're going to end this episode with some more great questions from our listeners. Because it's like Kamala Harris says, it's not about us, it's about you. Da, da, da. Right, Jason?
Well said. Oh, that was clever. So it really has been a year of disorder, Alex, and not just disorder on the podcast, but disorder out there in the world. I'd like to kick it off with my own question. What events of the year have stood out to you, Alex? This is the biggest year of elections, but more has been going on that I feel like is underneath the surface that people don't pay attention to.
I mean, the big news, which drowns out so many things around the world, for me this year has obviously been the ongoing nightmare in Ukraine. And then something which completely twisted our show because we ended up having to dedicate so many episodes to this topic of Israel, Gaza, and the trauma on both sides in that conflict and the complexity of it. And then the orange man who simply will not go away, which is Donald Trump. But what I've liked about the show is what we've also been able to do, which is try and pull out some of the other stories that really matter, like climate change, like the rise in artificial intelligence, like the challenges faced by immigration, like the challenge of the rise in populism and neopopulism. And then the rise of China and how to handle that longer term threat. And I had a great observation by somebody at the international conference I attended in Tbilisi recently, where they said Putin and Russia are more like a hurricane. It's like a storm that is hitting us now and creating damage. But China is more like climate change. It's a much more insidious, pervasive, and longer term problem facing the planet. So I feel one of the things we've tried to do in this podcast is make sure that we don't get so swept away by these big stories dominating the headlines that we lose sight of these smaller but really significant, not smaller, but less well covered in the media stories.
And I think one of the stories that we have covered, but maybe not enough, is the rise of certain kinds of conspiracy theories and misinformation.
Absolutely.
You hear the term all the time. It's in the news, but the implications of it, what does it mean when President Trump says they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats? We're going to be having something before the election on the double-layered meanings of conspiracy theories. And when I look back at this year of disorder, it's that a lot of the debate we have about politics is no longer about the actual issue. It's not about how do we have more legal migration and benefit from the skills to, make the NHS better. It's this bizarre debate about something else, which is actually conspiratorial, but is masking the real issues in a certain way. And then I agree, the whole year has been overshadowed by the October 7th tragedy and the Israel and Gaza mess. It's a conflict that, because of how much people care about it, creates culture war and fracturing, disordering camps that then play out in a mimetic way in central London and on university campuses. The loss of life in Gaza is a tragedy. The massacre on October 7th is inexcusable. But more people are dying in Sudan, probably in 1 month, than in the whole conflict. What happened in Syria in the civil war, millions of people got displaced from their homes. The whole country was destroyed and uninhabitable. But those conflicts didn't reshape interpersonal relationships, how the media covers every aspect of global affairs. And this conflict has interjected a degree of disorder and conspiratorial thinking that affects the US election, changed how 4 MPs didn't get elected because pro-Palestine independents were able to challenge Labour MPs who are arguably more pro-Palestine than their Tory challengers, just as, and I hope it's not true, but Kamala might lose Michigan, even though Trump would be worse on exactly the issue that people have not voted for her. So this thing embodies the enduring disorder, and Western countries and Middle Eastern countries can't coordinate together to get to a win-win solution. There's obviously a win-win solution, which is better for Israelis and Palestinians and Jews and Muslims and the Western world and our economies and Red Sea shipping, that clearly we could do something which is better for everyone, but we just can't coordinate ourselves out of this box because people are throwing hate and conspiracy. It's just such a powder keg of disorder that it's not even really possible to talk about how we're going to order the disorder in a coherent way.
I think that's really well put, Jason. And I want to go back to where you started, which is this cats and dogs conspiracy theory that Haitian immigrants are cooking up people's pets in Springfield, Ohio. My husband was on a trip recently with a very, very senior former Trump administration official, and not one of the nutcase officials, but a very respected
There are only
security
3 such people.
experts.
I can guess very easily who it might be.
And I'm not going to say who it was. And this person said, "Have you heard they're eating the pets in Springfield?" And he meant it. That's worrying. If that is really infecting the mindset of people who should know better. And it feeds this problem. And one of my favorite episodes was with Laura Thornton talking about disinformation, how we don't have shared facts. There's no longer trusted sources of information. And so it's almost impossible to come up with, well, this is the problem. There are different ways to address it, but at least we can all agree on what the problem is. We don't even agree on what the problem is or the dimensions of that problem. And so when you have no trusted sources, no shared assessment, the challenge to even get to an agreed solution becomes so much harder. And it's this year of deepening polarization, more populism, and more misinformation. It's a really toxic brew.
Yes, and the debate is not only over different facts, but different degrees of logic and causation. And we're not able to have an honest, genuine debate where results can emerge.
The other dimension to this, and I keep coming back to cats and dogs, maybe it's because I'm an animal lover.
Isn't it because you eat them? I think
they're all
because
still
it's your
here.
favorite appetizer.
No, they're all still here. I have one of them lying next to me on the chair. Sometimes George has to edit out the occasional sort of woof or a scratch on the door in this show. But going back to the cats and dogs, what's also happened is we are breaking decades of kind of norms of political behaviour. I mean, Boris Johnson did this, like you never lied to the Queen, you never lied in the Houses of Parliament, you tended to adhere to the sort of good chap theory of government. And he just sort of walked all the way through all of those. And Trump obviously also has broken many norms. But then you had J.D. Vance, actually stating on national television that, yeah, that cats and dogs story, it probably wasn't true, but it helped to illustrate a point. And if it helps to illustrate a point and draw attention to a real issue, which is immigration, then it's totally legitimate to do that.
I'm going to argue it's not just about drawing attention to an issue. We're going to have an episode with Joe Uzicki talking about conspiracy theories. I'm putting forth a kind of approach, which is that they operate under double truth theorem. On the one hand, some people will believe, yes, the migrants are eating the dogs and the cats. Yes, the election was stolen. But I would argue that most people who quote unquote subscribe to the theory don't take it at face value. They believe it has symbolic value. That, yes, they might have won the election, but they shouldn't have won, and there shouldn't be so many minorities that would have voted for them, and if this and if that, but you can't articulate that. So you just say the election is stolen. And this is an issue about how the enduring disorder is working that I don't think we've delved into enough. And I'm excited that, we're not just a 1 year and done show. We're going to get to explore these things further, Alex.
So I'm going to switch and ask you, Jason, so looking back, what have been your favorite moments from the show, the most insightful interviews, the guests you most enjoyed chatting to?
Well, I guess I'm like a parent with his or her children. I don't like being forced to choose favorites. I have a great degree of attachment to everything we've done. Sometimes when we're reviewing the episodes, I just get a moment of great joy when I hear the intro music. So I think listeners should be reminded that our intro music is called Those Spreadsheets Are Making Me Sick.
All right, that I did not know.
Ones that jump out at me are Armen Sarkisian, the former president of Armenia, talking about small states and their diasporas and how being small could be a strength. There's the recent episode we did with Harvey Whitehouse of Oxford about identity fusion and how individuals feel attached to their group and what that, comes from evolutionarily. I thought that was brilliant. My buddy who helped get this podcast started, Brian Klaas, he's been on the show a few times. I want to highlight what he's talked about in terms of the lack of free will and how us humans may be just a product of nerves and synapses and we respond in certain ways. Maybe an underappreciated episode is with Arthur Snell about all the homicides and corruption in the Caribbean and how the Caribbean might be the first place in the world that was truly globalized and where the world exported its disorder to it. And then maybe the best line of the entire podcast, Alex, is the Kurt Volker episode where you and I talk about how the 75th anniversary of NATO's foundation, the Washington summit, it needs to be the wedding where the West and Ukraine finally get married. And of course, we predicted that it wouldn't happen. It needed to happen. And then Kurt Volker closed that episode saying, it's only when things are existential enough, like the nuclear apocalypse, that people actually collaborate and they don't believe that misinformation or climate change or AI regulation are truly apocalyptic enough to put aside their petty grievances and collaborate. So yeah, those are some of my highlights, Alex. How about you?
My favorite episodes, quite a lot of them come from the montage clips we just heard. There's the great Jonathan Powell talking about what he learned negotiating over the Northern Ireland peace process. And I really loved his interview because so many of the lessons he drew from that are applicable to conflicts today, including that you do actually have to talk to your enemy. My other favorite episodes were Evgenia Kara-Murza, whose husband Vladimir was detained in Russia, and Bill Browder, who campaigned for the Magnitsky Act, again talking about Russia. And the reason I love their episodes for the huge moral clarity they bring to this debate about why Ukraine matters and why Putin is such a threat. And I'm very happy to share with you that my beloved husband, who calls this podcast surprisingly good, thank you so much, Dan, for that faint praise, he actually had dinner last week with Evgenia and Vladimir.
When did he get freed?
Vladimir?
Yes.
In the hostage exchange.
Oh, great. Tell us more about that. We didn't discuss it on the program.
Oh my gosh. He was one of the Russian political prisoners freed alongside Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street journalist, and the huge prisoner swap with the Russian double agents who were imprisoned in Slovenia going back to Russia. And Vladimir Karamazov was one of the best-known dissidents who were released on the Russian side. Anyway, my husband saw him and Evgenia last week and had dinner with them.
Oh,
and
my
was
God.
able to report, amazingly, that Vladimir is in very good spirits. He has some health issues, but he seems to have come through this ordeal, almost 2 years, a lot of it in solitary confinement, with his spirit unbowed. The other episode I really, really loved and was mentioned in the montage, that was the voice of Miles Taylor describing how he lost his home, his life savings, his marriage, and his career over his courageous decision to call out the Trump administration. He was a senior official at the Department of Homeland Security, and he was the author of the anonymous letter in the New York Times saying, "We are the resistance inside the Trump administration." And he's now working to expose the risks around artificial intelligence and how that can be manipulated to create deep fake videos that fool people into believing, for example, that their local polling station is closed for the day, so they shouldn't go and vote that day. So I found that a really educational episode, and he was such a compelling speaker. So, Jason, I'm going to throw a different question back to you, which is, what have you learned from the show? And has anything changed in your perspective as a result of listening to your guests?
Great question, Alex. In a way, my answer builds on what you were talking about. Moral courage, moral clarity, individual bravery, courage. I wouldn't have said 2 or more years ago that I thought that those were driving forces in human history. I would have said structural decisions like neoliberalism, the incentive structures created by tax havens. But in a way, by having a podcast and having met quote unquote important people like Bill Browder, Evgenia Karamazov, and Miles Taylor, and understanding the clarity with which they see issues and how they've acted, I've changed my opinion. I think that if, in fact, 5 specific Republicans over the course of the 2016 primary, or 3 or 4 specific Republicans in the wake of the January 6th had more courage or moral clarity, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. If, for example, McCarthy and McConnell after the January 6th had said, this is a bridge too far, now we're going to do the second impeachment, and laid the case before the American people, he wouldn't be running again and we wouldn't be in this position. So my takeaway is that individual action, particularly by prominent people who might be cowed into silence, who might be thinking about their own reelection, but who could stand up, that's unbelievably important. And that hits me because something has changed over time. And I think that if we look back at Bill Clinton and the Blair years and some of the people that they surrounded themselves with, they had courage of conviction and they had a moral clarity and purpose that I don't see in the Biden or even the Obama camp. And Obama was a great guy, but when things came up, he did a little bit of on the one hand, on the other hand. Well, we need to understand that we were wrong in this, and we need to understand that they were right in whatever. And that's changed my opinion that maybe if Biden and some of the people around him were better communicators, this is the line in the sand. It's not just that we're supporting the Ukrainians, it's that this is a war between barbarity and civilization. This violates the Budapest Memorandum commitment. This is this and this is this. And you know what? We're dying on this line in the sand. So maybe that's the greatest personal growth that I've experienced by reflecting on these wiser people who have had more experience than I have in making difficult decisions.
That's a really powerful point. It's so often said, well, if we didn't have Donald Trump, some other populist would have come along, or if we didn't have Boris Johnson, somebody else like him. But I think that underplays the role that they played in shattering norms. It's also true that trying to be reasonable can often lead us down rabbit holes as well. And the issue with negotiating peace in Northern Ireland or trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza is it requires very difficult decisions that will not please all sides and that may not have perfect moral clarity. So these are really difficult issues. In our imperfect world, perfect solutions may not be attainable. And that's the constant tension that real negotiators and real leaders have to grapple with. And social media amplifies that adoption of extreme positions where if the government does anything that is 1% short of ideal, you hammer away at it. And the government officials are just trying to get stuff done.
Alex, from your mouth to God's ears, you have the experience being in the room as a diplomat and former ambassador that I lack. And I think that delicate balance between compromise and moral clarity and how you go about that is something that you understand and know better than I. And you've articulated that really well to the listeners. I might just hire you to do the Ordering the Disorder segment of a podcast that I was thinking of having a second season of.
Oh, my contract is renewed another year, Jason. Is this a new announcement on air?
It is, Alex. You've done so well. You've spoken with such moral clarity and such nuance. I think we should talk every month.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. I'm going to throw out a little controversial thought here. Dear listeners, she says, using her Lady Whistledown voice, one of the issues that Jason and I have talked about off air behind the scenes, lifting the lid a little bit, is I think we've had some absolutely wonderful guests on this show. I would like us to bring more guests on the show whose views are very different from our own, to challenge us a little bit more, because I think there is a risk. Part of the reason we invite people on the show is because we have read the stuff they write, or we've heard them on other podcasts, or we've seen them in action, and we really admire their points of view and perspectives. And one of the things I've liked from listeners' questions is when they've pushed back on us on things. I've really liked that. And I would like us to invite a few people on who don't see the world the same way that we do.
I agree. We need to have a broad swath of opinion, but only within acceptable boundaries. Because this is the disorder program. We're trying to combat disorder and create order. But I want to point out, we have our Substack now. And one of the things I'm going to do in that Substack, which you can follow by the link in the show notes, dear listeners, is I'm going to platform some views there that I think are more controversial and maybe couldn't get full episodes on the main podcast. So we're going to have someone in the beginning of October who thinks that we shouldn't be fighting to defend Ukraine, that governments just shouldn't tax individuals. If the Russians invaded my Western European country, I'd just run away. I'd take my daughter and, I'd buy a house somewhere else. I wouldn't fight. And I would have said before having had these conversations with you, Alex, wait a second. I'm not sure I want that view on my podcast because we have certain values. And I've softened my stance, which is that with the correct caveats, I do think it is worth engaging with that opinion because this is a very intellectual person. He deserves to be heard in his own right. And of course, we're going to always push back. So I will say challenge accepted. I'm open to some growth. Let's make it less of an echo chamber. But as Kamala said, it has to be about you, meaning the listeners, and not us. Why don't we, after the break, order the disorder, Alex, by taking listener questions?
Excuse me, can you take a photo of me?
Sure, but if you had the new Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 6, you could snap your own hands-free selfies.
Really?
Watch. I just flex it to the perfect angle, set it down, and FlexCam with Galaxy AI automatically zooms for the perfect shot.
Whoa.
Boast-worthy.
New profile pic-worthy.
Flex the newest Galaxy AI foldable, Z Flip 6. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Samsung account login required. FlexCam length varies and is shorter than standard zoom length. Galaxy AI provided free until end of 2025 on supported devices.
The Starbucks cold brew you love is now available in a can. It's so good you'll believe that too good to be true can be true. Like finding out that you and your crush have been listening to the same playlist on repeat. With the smooth taste of Starbucks cold brew in a can, sipping is believing. Available in 3 delicious flavors. Shop now wherever you buy groceries. Click or tap the banner to learn more.
When it comes to fitness, what's real? How about when it really truly fits your life? That's how Anytime Fitness sees it. Because our coaches see you. It's how they build personal plans that work wherever you are and focus on everything that matters, from fitness to nutrition to recovery, all so you can push yourself further than ever or just through the next rep. It's total 360 support for a real difference. That's Anytime Fitness. That's Real AF. Visit AnytimeFitness.com.
We're back. Mega orderers, as always, thank you for writing in, and you can reach us at disordershow@gmail.com. We love your questions. The more practical, the more theoretical, the more hysterical, the better. So to kick it off, Alex, Jonathan L. writes us, does Putin represent the end of an era? And what might come next?
All right. Good question. Thank you, Jonathan. When I reply to this, I'm really sorry if I have missed the point of your admirably succinct question. But in my view, sadly, Putin doesn't represent the end of an era. He represents the return to an era I had once naively hoped we had moved beyond, which is great power politics. And Putin is a leader back in the more traditional mold of Soviet-style autocrats and an extension of a basic Russian mindset, an imperialistic mindset that views Russia as a great empire that should have a natural authority over its neighbours. And so he's not the end of an era. He is going back to a longer and deeper Russian tradition. And this is something that was discussed at a conference I was at recently, which is even if Vladimir Putin himself goes, there is embedded in the Russian psyche a more fundamental mindset about the nature of their state and their relationship with their neighbours that is very troubling. And so at this conference, some speakers were saying, it's not just that we need to get rid of Putin and see a more democratic leadership emerge. It's that we need to try and address and change that more fundamental Russian mindset. And that is a far harder task. And after all, I'm not trying to single out just Russia for this. I mean, America has its concept of exceptionalism. We in the UK, have a very rosy-tinted view about some aspects of our history and sort of blinker and cut out some other aspects of our history that are slightly less glorious. We all have our national myths, and that shapes how we deal with the world. And in Russia's case, it's a very dangerous mindset.
So, to disagree agreeably with you, Alex, everything that you say content-wise about the Russian mindset and Putin as a throwback both to the Tsarist period and the Soviet period, I agree with. But I would take Jonathan L's question from a different perspective. It's that, is this going to be the end of that era? Is the new person going to be Navalny-esque or Karamurza-esque and move Russian culture and history away from attempting to dominate the neighbors, away from Russian exceptionalism? And he wasn't asking looking backward, but asking to speculate about democratization processes in Russia, to which I can say we truly don't know. Depending on how the war ends, depending on if Mishustin or someone else does a palace coup and we just have a continuation of the regime but without Putin at its helm, we don't know. But there is a possibility that Putin will be the end of an era, because I don't think that the Russian people want that. They do want to be a part of Europe, and they have smartphones and are are very intelligent and many of them multilingual people who are aware of what's going on outside. So there is a possibility that depending on how things play out with Xi and Russia's relationship with China, that Putin will be the end of this era of Russian empire and autocracy over its own people.
Let me read you the next question. And this comes from Thomas G. And actually it follows on quite nicely. My question was about the emerging supposed multipolar world. Are countries of the global south naive about the motives of countries like Russia and China? Do they not see the imperialistic intentions?
Love the question. Love the mega orderers. So much insights that they have. Thomas G., I think you're on to something. As someone who's traveled fairly extensively in the Arab world, Africa, and even Latin America, I think people are naive about the imperialistic intentions of Russia and China because they are perceived as the underdogs. Those countries have suffered under the imperialism mostly of the traditional Western powers, Britain, France, Spain, the US. So they say, oh, look, these Russian and Chinese, they're fighting the West, therefore they must be on our side. Of course, they're fighting the West, but they're not on the side of those little dogs. The Chinese would do debt trap imperialist diplomacy in Africa, just as the British and French did in the 19th century. And the Russians had their own empire in Central Asia, and they attempted to have a Soviet empire in every part of the world, from Latin America to Africa. But they've done a very good job of playing into anti-imperialist narratives that hoodwink people. This is partly because during the decolonization struggles of the 1950s and 60s, the Russians and the Chinese did a great job by giving arms and skills and medical care and advisors to the oppressed. And therefore, they were able to push their narratives as a result of it. Simultaneously, we in the West have done a very bad job of winning the war in terms of Voice of America and BBC World in explaining that America and Britain are not the evil bad guys and that the Russian and Chinese do a lot of imperialistic tricks. And I think that's because we don't have the self-confidence that our way of life is in fact moral and justified. We've lost confidence exactly at the moment that a lot of our way of life is in fact more moral and more just. Whereas when it was less moral and less just in the imperialist period, there was the cultural confidence to try to sell it. When you read Arabic media about Russia, Russia is entirely unself-interested. They're helping the Tunisian people in their fight against evil, meanie, bad French imperialism. They're fighting the Americans who were going to have that corrupt trade deal in Egypt. Oh, and all the humanitarian assistance that's given to Egypt by America, that's just an imperialist trap. The Russians and the Chinese, on the other hand, are helping the Egyptian people out of the spirit of friendship and cooperation. So yes, I think that this is a huge, ongoing public relations failure and nightmare.
Well, you're more charitable than I am, Jason, because I don't think the leaders of the global south are naive. I think they are deeply cynical.
I need to jump in. I wasn't talking about leaders. I took the question to mean people who are reading broadsheets and social media posts in Egypt, Tunisia, and Peru and being like, yeah, the West is bad. The Russians are fighting them. I kind of like them. Obviously, the leaders and the elites are completely cynical. I took it to mean public opinion in those countries.
Okay, fair enough. And they're being fed a narrative that is very attractive. And then they can point to the conflict in Israel, Gaza to say, and the West are so hypocritical and are applying double standards. So there's a narrative there which lands with public opinion. But what I was going to say is that I think the leaders of these countries are deeply cynical, and Russian and Chinese aid comes without strings attached. There's none of this really annoying human rights conditionality. And, for example, a lot of the African leaders have been quite happy to see Russian mercenaries come into their countries to help them stay in power. It is a deeply cynical system. And they've been happy to see Chinese money coming in because it's loans and investments on very favorable terms.
But it does have strings attached because then the Chinese own the port in your
I
country.
know. But it doesn't come with the lecturing about human rights and democracy. The strings attached are like spiders' webs that actually gradually ensnare these countries in a horrible trap, like ceding control over really important deep sea ports and parts of that country's critical national infrastructure. It comes with accepting that the jobs created are for Chinese labourers, not for locals. And that is having a very dangerous backlash in those societies. They have signed a Faustian pact, and the costs and consequences of this are now beginning to be felt. In the Maldives, there is huge political turmoil. In Sri Lanka, there has been huge political turmoil because the Chinese effectively seized control of Sri Lanka's biggest port.
And let us not forget that the whole belt from the Atlantic to the Red Sea in the Sahel region has essentially become taken over by Russia and its mercenaries, whereby the post-coup regimes there get regime security, but the Russians aren't doing it to, help them or even to fight the West. They're doing it because they do illegal gold mining. They get to base military assets there. And they're promoting jihadis and illicit criminal networks and human smuggling in that region. And the West, in a region that had traditionally been a Franco-American preserve, particularly in this northwestern African bit of the Sahel, have forfeited this traditional sphere of influence, which allows the Russians to pressure us with flows of migrants and to really export chaos from the Sahel into North Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe. It's been deeply tragic.
And now I'm going to sound like one of those people who hates our own societies and gets attacked by right-wing extremists for doing down our countries. How they're doing it may be worse, but what they're doing is not totally dissimilar to European colonialism. That is exactly what the UK did in India. We signed agreements with Indian leaders and raped that country of its resources and assets. Look at what Belgium did in the Congo.
I'm sorry, I need to interject, Alex. You cannot mention the British experience either in the Raj or in the East India Company and compare it to the Belgians in the Congo.
Read William Dalrymple. Read William Dalrymple.
I've read all those books. I disagree. I just fundamentally disagree. The Belgian in the Congo was a rape and pillage style operation with machetes chopping people's arms off. The situation in India, particularly after the weakness of the Mughals, was a very complicated situation. And we have to think of a neoliberal style profit-seeking shareholder company in the East India Company, which was not really controlled by the British government. What happened after the mutiny and what happened before are two very, very different situations, and we need to have any nuance in our discussion of this point.
All right. The East India Company, it was a mercenary organization that was allowed to pillage India.
Correct, but that wasn't British governmental policy. That was a private corporation, just like.
And eventually there were efforts made to bring it under control.
But that's like saying you should blame Switzerland for the fact that Glencore has relationships with African dictators where essentially they back the African dictator to have slave labor in the mines and to oppress the people and extract the minerals. The Swiss government has no role in that. Glencore operates entirely on its own.
But this goes to some of the debates we've had. Haven't we been making the point that the social media companies of today are sowing misinformation, are pouring in money into political action committees to get their favoured pet congressman re-elected so that they can continue to act and Congress cannot pass legislation? It is disingenuous to say that we had no responsibility for what the East India Company was doing. We were very happy to take the profits from that trade, and generations of British men profited on the proceeds of that. And then to wash our hands and say, but it was nothing to do with us.
It's more complicated, Alex, because...
It may be more complicated, but we cannot wash our hands of what was done.
I'm not trying to wash our hands. I'm trying to introduce a degree of moral nuance, which is that the King of Belgium instructed a policy which, in his private capacity, was the rape and pillage of the Congo. What happened in India is a far more complicated story of a profit-making enterprise, which at many times went against British stated policy. Maybe you should have said that Whitehall should have enforced its own rules and constrained the company, which hurt British interests. And in some cases they did, because they wanted missionaries, for example, to be allowed to function, because that was British government policy. But the East India Company was against those missionaries because they were seen as harming the profit motive. When it comes to social media companies today, that only would enforce my case, which is that Congress is to be blamed for not regulating them more. But Congress is not benefiting from the fact that some tech billionaires are busy screwing over global democracy for their own profit. Congress isn't benefiting from that. They should have had a more sophisticated regulatory approach, but there's no conspiracy between Congress and some tech billionaires. It's just bad policymaking.
There's a question of degree, and then there's a question of culpability. When you are standing before a court, you can knowingly have committed a crime, and you can knowingly have allowed crimes to have been committed and pretended that you didn't know anything about them because you were profiting from them. So it's a question of moral degree. It's like that famous Churchill quote, "We've already established what you are, madam. We are merely haggling over the price." It's a question of degree. And I concede up front that the parallels are not exact. But if you are one of those countries that was occupied, and where the question began about why are they so naive about Russian and Chinese imperialism, well, it's because they can look to the West and they can see, not that I agree with this analysis, that they can see that Russia ostensibly stood up for the non-aligned movement, while it was the European powers who were the original colonizers.
I think
so
that's
some
BS.
of them will have that legacy. But I think their leaders are deeply cynical. I think their motives are deeply cynical. But to claim that we have no legacy that we need to be ashamed of ourselves and that we are purer than pure is just not true.
But no one's claiming that. As unpopular and unfashionable as it would be to default to Neil Ferguson, I would direct listeners who want a nuanced portrayal here to engage with his work, whether it's Empire or Colossus, and to look at the fact that, yes, there was a lot of expropriation in British Empire in India, but it wasn't the same as French Empire in Algeria. It wasn't settler colonialism of merely expropriating land, kicking and turfing the natives off and taking their land. It came with railroads and schools, and it had a different degree of nuance. But that's not exactly the argument we're having, which is that the culpability is a failure to regulate the private sector, not that some master connivance was going on in Whitehall whereby an imperial system existed to have a series of bogus treaties to expropriate wealth and this, that, and the other. It's just a much more complicated legacy. And I don't want to talk down the West when we face such existential threats. And I think that the Chinese and Russian imperialism of today is far more nefarious than even the ills of British and American policy previously. But we digress, Alex. So that's more than enough from me. And I'm sorry for being a centrist white dad. And I look forward to the listeners attacking me on it. Please, you can write us and make fun of us as much as you want. Now let's get to another question. We have a fantastic question from Esther S. Esther writes, I am a born mega orderer, but I just happen to be going through a bit of personal disorder in my life, and I would like to get the opportunity to ask multiple multi-part questions because it might just help me order my own disorder. Alex, have you changed your mind about anything, doubled down on anything over the first year of the pod?
I'm tempted to answer evasively like Kamala Harris when asked about her changing stance on policies. And she says, well, my values haven't changed. So I like to think that over the last year, my values haven't changed. What is true is that I've wrestled internally a lot, not least through the kind of arguments that I have with Jason on this pod, on and off air, about our approach to certain international issues. Israel-Gaza is one that I really have struggled with backwards and forwards in my mind, because I'm sort of going through, on the one hand, what Hamas did was absolutely beyond the pale, and any country that had faced that kind of attack would obviously want to push back, defend themselves, and try and put themselves in a position where it could never happen again. And I am not in the minds and the shoes of the Israeli military commanders having to decide on the best tactics. On the other hand, this is a conflict that didn't just begin on the 7th of October. It doesn't justify how Hamas has chosen to pursue that conflict, but there are legitimate questions about how Israel has handled the relationships with Palestinians and its behavior on the West Bank, and its keeping Gaza in a kind of vice for many, many years. Despite the withdrawal, it still has controlled a lot of life within Gaza. And of course, there are questions about the conduct of the war. And so the kind of things that I've wrestled internally is trying to find the moral clarity in situations that are immensely complex, both historically and in terms of understanding that there is trauma on both sides, and both sides have legitimate grievances, and both sides have committed mistakes. And so it's a kind of wrestling internally rather than changing my mind about something. Jason, how about you? I'll feed it into her second question about what has changed for you both personally and in your take on the world, which kind of builds on the first one. Have you changed your mind about anything or doubled down on anything?
Well, I've gone through a lot of personal disorder over the year, from the renovations on my house not turning out as I had wanted them to, changing relationships and the emotional disorder and struggle that comes from that. In terms of my take on the world, I think that the disorder is actually deeper than I ever imagined, and that there is an extent to which we're living in times that Abraham Lincoln could have described as a house divided against itself cannot stand. I wouldn't have thought that the culture war would be truly at the pinnacle of foreign policy making. And I guess that's a doubling down in my perspectives, because I see not just Israel-Gaza policy, but Ukraine-Russia policy and climate change policy and tax policy as all subordinated to the culture war, whereby within the West, we are at each other's throats and can't agree on facts. So my take on the world is that because there are no neutral facts, literally every major question has been partisanified. Your take on Israel-Gaza and the correct tax policy is somehow subordinated to your identity politics within the British and American debates about migrants and LGBT and whatever, so that the world is like one of these prism kaleidoscope things, and depending on which kaleidoscope that you put on your eyes, every given question changes in color and in its fractals. I didn't grasp how that is happening at every level. And doing this program has, in a way, opened my eyes to how different people feel. I also would have to say that by talking to regular people and regular voters, I understand more now how the undecided, or I dislike Trump as a person, but I quote unquote like his policies. I have more empathy with their frustrations about the state of the world in the US and the UK, because I've traditionally come at some of these questions from an elite policy wonkish perspective, and I've had to grow, as it were, and have more empathy there. Now to Esther's third multi-part question. What is your view of the change in the overall state of world disorder, both qualitatively and quantitatively, in the last year? And how are today's most recent geopolitical flashpoints like Bangladesh or Israel-Gaza different or the same to what had come before in pre-2023 disorder?
There's not enough time to give as much nuance to this answer as I would like. Thank you for the question. It's very multi-layered. I'm just going to offer one observation, which is pre-2023, although actually I would probably move the date back to about pre-2016. I would say there was still a more general confidence that the US-led West of sort of NATO and its democratic allies around the world still was playing a very confident mega ordering world, with some exceptions. I mean, they made mistakes in Syria. Since then, what I have begun to see is more doubt about US leadership, more doubt about the relationship between the US and its allies, more doubt about whether the US could truly be tested to come to the aid of allies, more doubt about the West's resolve to uphold the international world order, and more claims from a rising power like China not to create a new world order in its mold. It doesn't actually want to take over responsibility for managing the world. It just wants to undermine the US's ability to do so and to create a more multipolar world. And a line that I heard recently is that when hegemons decline, other countries hedge. And so what you are now seeing is more countries around the world less sure about US leadership, being more willing to hedge their bets. And that is creating a more uncertain dynamic.
I think there is a new kind of disorder. It's not that it's just from 2023 onward, but the extent to which major crises can happen in mediumly important countries and no one really does anything. So I'm talking about the Sudanese civil war or the coup that's happened in Bangladesh and the humanitarian crisis that's going on there now. I'd like to think that if these things had happened 10 years ago, it's not like the international community would have solved the issue, but they would have done more. Whether that would have been humanitarian assistance or trying to mediate between the sides. Now it's like if it isn't Ukraine or Israel, Gaza, the EU, UK, and US do not have the bandwidth to even have an international conference to try to solve the issue. Obviously, I'm disgusted by this, but I guess I can't say that I'm surprised. The world is so disordered that literally this thing is happening as it is in Bangladesh or Sudan. Or what about the Tigrayan civil war in Ethiopia? Most people barely hear about it. It's not in the newspapers. I talk to my parents who are educated people and they read the New York Times cover to cover every day. I mentioned to them that we were going to do something about Bangladesh and isn't it horrible what's happening there? And they're like, what's happening there? And I'm like, well, Muhammad Yunus was happened to be bringing in as a technocratic prime minister, and now they're having to this. And they're like, but who's Muhammad Yunus? What's happened in Bangladesh? Because even in the New York Times, it's not covered, and they read the physical paper. The disorder is so great that medium power countries, Bangladesh has more than 130 million people. It has a reasonable sized economy. That has hit me because I did not think things of that size and scale, like in Sudan, could happen, and we would really have no response. Or the Houthis, attacking not just Israel, but Red Sea shipping and changing the nature of the global economy. And our response is, we drop a few bombs, but there are no conferences to fix this. We're not working with our Saudi or Emirati allies about a new intervention or special forces. So it's harmed the global economy a few $100 billion. We can deal with that. Let's wait till after the election.
It's true. Very good observation. So, Jason, can we try and end on a slightly more upbeat note? Esther, in her multi-part question, I'm going to take the last two together. Is there any new ordering? Are there any new orderers? Who have you got your eye on? And given my overall melancholy, I need you both to tell me what small rays of hope can you point to in this chaotic and scary world? Can you provide us with something to give us some comfort?
Oh, Esther, I would like to give you a lot of comfort. There is not many opportunities to draw on, but I think there are some. The ray of hope is my main man, the mega orderer-in-chief, Sir Keir. He is messianic in his non-messianicness and charismatic in his non-charisma. Some people might feel that anything that has to do with the winter fuel allowance, ergo cannot be mega ordering, that it's just such small fry issues that Keir is working on. But I think that he's faced down the rebels over the two-child cap, that he's facing down rebels over the winter fuel allowance. He's trying gradually to bring together. Things are happening. Ordering is going on. So who do I's got my eye on? It is my main man, Sir Keir. And we're going to need him big time if the orange orangutan comes into office, because then he's going to need to have conferences about European defense and how NATO's nuclear deterrents work if the Americans are not involved. And I think he will more snap into action.
I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts. One is the continuing support for Ukraine. It has been a very difficult road, and NATO has wobbled, and there have been questions about the US. But nevertheless, 2 years in, NATO has sustained support for Ukraine. It's taken too long, but it's got there in giving Ukraine more weapons and hopefully continuing to lift limits on how those weapons can be used. And NATO has found its purpose again and has also been gearing up to establish greater, more sustained, longer-term deterrence measures. So in those moments where you perceive existential threats, you do see people coming together to try and put in place effective measures. And then I will mention the role of individuals. I don't think Joe Biden's presidency has been great, but it's not been bad. And it took a huge personal decision for him to step aside and let Harris come forward. There are still individuals on this planet who put their country's needs above parties' needs or their own personal wishes. And so you get those moments. There are lots of us out there who still believe in values and in trying to do the right thing. Imperfectly, but we still believe in it. And so we should keep hope and not give up, because if we give up, then we are definitely ceding the territory.
I couldn't think of a better note to end this relatively inspiring episode. Alex, I think your husband is onto something. You are surprisingly inspiring.
That's really funny. Despite being so much older than you, Jason, I still have passion for stuff, right?
I might argue that you have even more passion for stuff than me and are less jaded. And it's one of the things that I find very charming and pleasant to work with you on. You've been around the block, but you know your values.
I've been around the block.
Diplomatically, in your diplomatic career. You've been around the block, and yet you're still excited about ideas and the world. And I would say maybe you have more energy than I tend to.
I get completely energized whenever we do an interview. That's something that I have learned through doing this podcast. So perhaps that's a really good note to end this podcast on, which is to say thank you, because you have opened a doorway for me to get really motivated about things. So thank you, everyone who tunes in to us, who's listened, who's given us feedback. Thank you, Jason and George, for bringing me into this show. And if you want to help us order the disorder, please tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every new episode launches. And that's definitely enough from me.
It's more than enough from me as well, Alex. But if you, for some reason, are a glutton for punishment and would like more on this episode and other observations of mine, please subscribe to the Substack. Link is in the show notes. I'm going to be doing some stuff for paid subscribers over the next week where I talk about undecided voters that I talk to in New Jersey and what they say and what their arguments are, because people might think that there are no undecided voters, but there are. I hear them and I interact with them all the time. So you've heard it enough times, but literally he can't get enough praise. Our producer is the one, the only, the George McDonagh. He has made this happen. Our executive producer is Neil Fearn.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you have an orderly week. Tune in for the next year. I went to a tailgate. And the whole parking lot was just jam-packed with massive pickup trucks.
Yes.
Huge boom boxes, giant flags, everybody decked out in their team's uniform. And I had a Lamar Jackson shirt on as well, which I'm afraid I stole from my son's wardrobe. And then, people were just putting on these amazing cookouts. There were full-on barbecues and grills. I had venison, I had steak. Then there were these vast salads. And initially I was thinking, well, this isn't exactly Ascot, is it? Where are the smoked salmon and champagne hampers? And then I was like, you know what? These blackberry vodka jellos are really good. And there was like a whole drinks bar with sort of vodka and tequila and champagne.
It's a different vibe.
It's a different vibe, but in their own way. It leaves, the little hampers at Glyndebourne and Ascot wanting.